What's the darkest family secret you've ever exposed? My grandparents smiled at me over dinner and said, "We've decided you need more discipline. Starting tonight, you're sleeping in the basement." I laughed because these were the same people who let me eat ice cream for breakfast and never enforced a single rule. But that night at 9 p.m., Grandpa actually walked me to the basement door. I was still grinning, waiting for them to say, "Just kidding," when I heard the deadbolt slide shut from outside. "Grandma?" I rattled the door. Nothing. Through the floorboards, I heard them watching TV like nothing happened. The basement was freezing, just a mattress on concrete. These were the people who used to let me sleep in their bed during thunderstorms. Now they wouldn't even give me a blanket. At 4 a.m., they burst downstairs screaming, "Inspection!" Grandma started counting everything. My socks, my books, my hair ties. Grandpa measured the distance between my mattress and the wall with a ruler. "What is happening?" I asked, shaking from cold. "Stop being dramatic," Grandma said sweetly. "This builds character." Every night got worse. They installed motion sensors that shrieked if I moved, removed the basement bathroom door, put locks on the food upstairs. These were the same grandparents who taught me to bake cookies and called me their precious angel. By week 2, I was barely functioning. When I tried to hug Grandma in the kitchen, she recoiled. "You smell like basement," she said, disgusted. I tested them. Stayed at school 10 minutes late. Grandma's reaction was psychotic, sobbing, threatening to call the police, saying I was destroying their final years. But while grounding me, I caught Grandpa smirking. That night, I heard them on the phone. "She's almost ready. Another week maximum." Ready for what? I snuck into Grandpa's office and opened his computer. His email was open to a message chain titled, "Package Transfer." My blood froze. They were discussing me like cargo. The emails were with someone named Catherine Monroe. She'd been offering my grandparents money for years, begging them to return what was stolen. The most recent offer, $200,000. Then I found the adoption papers. Not mine, my mother's. My grandparents had illegally adopted my mother 40 years ago, bought her from traffickers for $5,000. Catherine Monroe was my mother's biological mother, my real grandmother, who'd been searching for her stolen daughter for decades. My mother never knew. She died thinking these were her real parents. But there was more. A life insurance policy on me worth $500,000, payable if I died or disappeared before 18. Another email chain with someone called the Facilitator, about international placement for difficult cases. They were going to sell me, just like they'd bought my mother. At breakfast, I spread everything on the table. "Just tell me why," I said. Grandma set down her coffee carefully. "You were supposed to be grateful, compliant, like your mother. But you got your mother's real blood," Grandpa said. "Fighter blood, Catherine's blood. It ruins everything." "We're 78 years old," Grandma said. "Do you know what medical bills cost? What assisted living costs? You're worth $500,000, but only if you're gone by next month. My real grandmother has been trying to find me? That criminal?" Grandma laughed. "She's obsessed. Hired investigators, sued us 12 times. We had to fake your mother's death certificate to stop her." "Wait, Mom's death certificate?" That's when I understood. The car accident when I was 5. The closed casket. The quick cremation. "She's not dead, is she?" Grandma's mask finally slipped. She found out the truth. Started asking questions. So we had her committed. Paranoid schizophrenia. She's been in a facility for 12 years thinking she imagined you. "Sign this." Grandpa pushed papers across the table. "Agree to emancipation. Leave voluntarily. Everyone wins." I picked up the pen. My hand was perfectly steady. But instead of signing, I hit record on my phone and asked one question that made them confess everything. I pulled my phone from my pocket and set it on the table between us, my thumb hovering over the record button. My voice came out steadier than I expected when I asked them to explain exactly how they bought my mother and why they thought they could sell me too. Grandma's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips, and Grandpa's face went completely blank, that careful mask he wore slipping just enough that I could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. I pressed record and watched the red dot appear on my screen, then asked again, slower this time, making sure every word would be clear on the playback. Grandpa started to stand, but I kept talking, asking about the $5,000 they paid for a 6-month-old baby, about Catherine Monroe's lawsuits, about the fake death certificate, about Mom locked in a psychiatric facility for 12 years because she remembered the truth. Grandma's hand started shaking, and she set the cup down hard enough that coffee sloshed onto the table. She opened her mouth, and I saw her about to deny everything, but Grandpa put his hand on her arm and said they'd done what they had to do, that Catherine was unstable and dangerous, that Mom had been sick and needed help, that I was being dramatic about a simple business arrangement. I asked what business arrangement involved taking out a life insurance policy on your granddaughter and selling her to human traffickers. Grandma's voice went high and thin when she said I didn't understand how expensive everything was, how their medical bills were crushing them, how I should be grateful they'd raised me at all when they could have just handed me over years ago. Grandpa lunged across the table and his fingers were inches from my phone when I yanked it back and tapped the screen 3 times in quick succession. The recording uploaded to the cloud storage accounts I'd set up the night before, sending copies to 3 different email addresses I'd created using the library computers at the school. I told him it was too late while he was still reaching for me, his face red and twisted with rage. Nothing like the gentle grandfather who used to let me win at checkers. The progress bar hit 100%, and I held up the phone so he could see the confirmation message. 3 little check marks showing the files had been successfully delivered. Grandma made a sound like a wounded animal and grabbed for my wrist, but I was already moving, shoving my chair back so hard it clattered to the floor. Grandpa said I had no idea what I'd just done, that I'd destroyed everything, that they'd spent 40 years building their life, and I'd ruined it in 5 minutes. I backed toward the kitchen door and told them I knew exactly what I'd done, that I'd made sure the truth couldn't be buried anymore, that every word they'd just said was safely stored where they couldn't delete it or destroy it. Grandma's face changed then, the sweet mask cracking completely like ice breaking on a frozen pond. She started screaming that I'd killed them, that they'd die in poverty because of my selfishness, that I was an ungrateful little monster who didn't deserve anything they'd given me. Her voice got louder and higher until she was shrieking about medical bills and assisted living costs, and how I'd stolen their only chance at security. Grandpa moved around the table toward me and his hands were reaching out, not in the grabbing way from before, but slower, more deliberate, like he was planning exactly where to put them. I didn't wait to see what he intended. I spun and ran for the front door, my bare feet slapping on the hardwood floor, my phone clutched so tight in my hand that my knuckles went white. Behind me, I heard Grandma still screaming and Grandpa's heavier footsteps following, and I grabbed the doorknob and yanked it open and ran outside in nothing but my pajamas and the phone. The morning air hit me cold and sharp, and I sprinted across the lawn toward the neighbor's house, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might break through my ribs. The Hendersons had lived next door since before I was born, and Mrs. Henderson used to give me cookies when I was little. I pounded on their door with my fist, not caring that it was barely 7 in the morning, not caring that I was sobbing, so hard I could barely breathe. Mr. Henderson opened the door in his bathrobe and his eyes went wide when he saw me shaking on his porch. I tried to tell him I needed help, but the words came out broken and gasping, and Mrs. Henderson appeared behind him and pulled me inside without asking any questions. She wrapped a blanket around my shoulders while I gulped air and tried to make my voice work. Mr. Henderson asked what happened, and I managed to say that my grandparents tried to hurt me, that I needed to call the police, that I had proof of what they'd done. Mrs. Henderson sat down next to me on their couch and kept one hand on my shoulder while I pulled up the emergency number on my phone. My fingers were shaking so badly I could barely type, but I got the numbers right and pressed call. Mr. Henderson stood by the window watching my grandparents' house while the phone rang, and when the dispatcher answered, I said I needed police immediately because my grandparents had been abusing me and planning to kill me. 2 patrol cars pulled up 14 minutes later, their lights flashing but no sirens, and I watched through the Hendersons' front window as the officers got out and approached the house. Mrs. Henderson had made me tea that I hadn't touched, and Mr. Henderson had called their daughter to let her know what was happening. The officers knocked on my grandparents' door, and I saw Grandma answer it, her face composed and calm like nothing had happened, like she hadn't been screaming about poverty and death 20 minutes ago. One officer stayed talking to her while the other walked back to his car, and I knew they were going to come talk to me next. Mrs. Henderson squeezed my shoulder and said I was safe now, that I'd done the right thing calling for help. The officer who'd gone to his car came to the Hendersons' door and introduced himself as Officer Gallo, and I showed him my phone with the recording still queued up and ready to play. He listened to the whole breakfast conversation, his expression getting more serious with every minute, and when it finished he asked if he could take my phone as evidence. I said yes, but asked him to make sure the files stayed in the cloud where my grandparents couldn't erase them. He called for backup and a detective, then went back to talk to my grandparents again while his partner stayed with me at the Hendersons' house. Detective Bartlett showed up an hour later in an unmarked sedan, a tall man in his 40s with gray starting at his temples and tired eyes that looked like they'd seen too much. He sat down across from me in the Hendersons' living room and asked me to tell him everything from the beginning. I started with the basement imprisonment 3 weeks ago, the motion sensors and the locked food and the 4 a.m. inspections, then moved backward to finding the emails about selling me and the adoption papers showing my mother had been bought from traffickers. Detective Bartlett took notes in a small leather notebook, writing quickly but stopping me sometimes to ask for specific dates or exact wording from the emails. When I got to the part about my mother being alive in a psychiatric facility, locked up for 12 years because she'd started remembering the truth, he looked up sharply and asked which facility. I told him I didn't know, that the emails hadn't said, but that my grandparents had mentioned she'd been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia to explain away her memories. He wrote that down carefully and asked about Catherine Monroe, whether I knew how to contact her or where she lived. I gave him the email address from Grandpa's computer and explained that she was my real grandmother, my mother's biological mother, who'd been searching for 40 years. Detective Bartlett asked questions about times and locations, about who else might have known what was happening, about whether my grandparents had ever hurt me physically before the basement. I told him about the motion sensors shrieking if I moved at night, about having no bathroom door, about the locks on the food upstairs that left me hungry for days. He asked if I had any injuries, and I showed him the bruises on my arms from where Grandpa had grabbed me during inspections, the raw spots on my ankles from sleeping on concrete. Mrs. Henderson brought more tea, and Detective Bartlett thanked her, then asked if I felt safe staying with the Hendersons temporarily, while they processed the scene next door. I said yes because I couldn't imagine going back to that house. Couldn't imagine sleeping in that basement ever again. He told me a social worker was on the way, and that I'd need to give another statement later, but for now I should try to rest. I asked what would happen to my grandparents, and he said based on what I'd told him and the recording I'd provided, they'd likely be arrested today. A woman named Carlotta showed up 40 minutes later carrying a tablet and a worn leather bag. She introduced herself as a social worker with Child Protective Services and sat down next to me with a gentle smile that actually reached her eyes. She looked younger than I expected, maybe 30, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and a way of sitting that made her seem approachable instead of official. Carlotta asked how I was holding up, and I said I didn't know, which was the truth. She nodded like that made perfect sense and said she was here to make sure I had somewhere safe to stay and that my needs were being met. Detective Bartlett excused himself to coordinate with the officers next door, and Carlotta pulled up some forms on her tablet. She asked about other family members, about friends' parents who might take me in temporarily, about anyone I trusted who could provide a safe place while the investigation proceeded. I told her about Catherine Monroe and explained the whole situation, how she was my biological grandmother but we'd never met, how she'd been searching for my mother for decades but didn't know I existed. Carlotta listened carefully and made notes on her tablet, asking questions about whether Catherine had any criminal history or red flags that I knew about. I said I didn't think so, that from the emails she seemed desperate to find her daughter and willing to pay my grandparents just to get her back. Carlotta said she'd try to locate Catherine and verify she was a safe placement option. But in the meantime, I couldn't go back to my grandparents' house and would need emergency foster care. I asked how long that would take, and she said probably just a few days, that cases like mine got priority processing. Mrs. Henderson offered to let me stay with them, but Carlotta explained that foster placements had to go through official channels, that she appreciated the offer, but there were legal requirements. I felt my chest get tight thinking about going to stay with strangers, about sleeping in another unfamiliar place. But Carlotta said she'd find somewhere good, and would stay in touch every day to make sure I was okay. Through the window, I watched more police cars arrive and officers carrying equipment into my grandparents' house. Detective Bartlett came back and told Carlotta they'd gotten a search warrant approved and were processing the scene now. He said they'd found the email correspondence on Grandpa's computer, the adoption papers in a filing cabinet, and the life insurance policy in a desk drawer. In the basement, they'd documented the motion sensors, the missing bathroom door, the locks on the food storage, and the notebook where Grandpa had been tracking my schedule and behavior. He said the evidence was extensive and disturbing, that they'd likely file charges within hours. Carlotta asked about my mother, and Detective Bartlett said he'd contacted the psychiatric facility and confirmed she was a patient there, that he'd be following up to investigate the circumstances of her admission. I asked if I could see her, and he said not yet, that they needed to verify the situation first and make sure any contact would be safe for both of us. 2 hours later, I watched through the neighbor's window as police officers led my grandparents out of their house in handcuffs. Grandmother was crying and calling out for me, saying this was all a misunderstanding, while grandfather walked silently with his jaw clenched tight. Detective Bartlett came back inside and sat down across from me at the kitchen table. He explained they were being charged with kidnapping, child abuse, and conspiracy to commit murder, and there would likely be more charges coming as they investigated the trafficking of my mother 40 years ago. I asked what would happen to me now, and he said Carlotta was working on that, but I definitely couldn't go back to that house. Mrs. Henderson offered me a sandwich, but I couldn't eat, just kept staring at my hands and thinking about how those same hands had been locked in that basement just days ago. Carlotta came in carrying her tablet and a small overnight bag she'd packed with some of my clothes from the house. She explained they hadn't been able to locate Catherine yet, but were working on it, and in the meantime, I'd need to go to a temporary foster home for a few days. I felt my chest get tight at the thought of staying with more strangers, but Carlotta said the family was experienced and kind, and she'd check on me every single day. Detective Bartlett drove us to a house about 20 minutes away, where a couple in their 50s greeted us at the door. They introduced themselves and showed me to a small guest room with blue walls and a window that looked out at their backyard. Carlotta stayed for an hour helping me settle in, making sure I had her phone number saved and telling me to call anytime, day or night, if I needed anything. After she left, I just sat on the edge of the bed staring at the wall, trying to process that my entire life had been built on lies and trafficking and plans to kill me for insurance money. The foster parents knocked gently and asked if I wanted dinner, but I said no, and they didn't push, just left a plate outside my door in case I got hungry later. I barely slept that night, kept jerking awake thinking I was back in the basement hearing those motion sensors. The next morning my phone rang and I saw Detective Bartlett's name on the screen. He told me they'd found Catherine living 3 states away, and she was already on her way to meet me, should arrive by tomorrow afternoon. His voice got gentler as he warned me this would be overwhelming for everyone since she'd been searching for my mother for 40 years and just found out I existed. I asked what she was like, and he said she seemed strong and determined, had been calling his office every hour since they contacted her wanting updates. After we hung up, I finally ate the breakfast the foster parents had left outside my door, then spent the rest of the morning giving more statements to police about the basement and the emails and everything I'd found on grandfather's computer. Around noon, a man in his 60s showed up at the foster home and introduced himself as Finn Woods, Catherine's attorney who'd been helping her search all these years. He sat down with me at the kitchen table and pulled out a folder full of old photographs. The first one he showed me was a baby picture from 40 years ago, and I felt my breath catch because it was like looking at my own baby photos. He explained that was my mother before she was stolen, back when her real name was Rebecca Ann Monroe. Finn spread out more photos showing my mother as a baby with Catherine, and I couldn't stop staring at how much I looked like both of them. He told me Catherine had hired him 20 years ago after her 12th lawsuit against my grandparents failed, and they'd been following leads and filing legal challenges ever since. Finn pulled out a timeline he'd made showing every step of Catherine's search over 4 decades. 12 lawsuits against my grandparents that all got dismissed. Hundreds of leads that went nowhere. Thousands of dollars spent on private investigators. But Catherine never gave up. Never stopped believing she'd find her daughter someday. I asked why the lawsuits failed, and Finn explained my grandparents had fake adoption papers and death certificates. Had built an entire false legal history that fooled judges for years. He said Catherine knew they were lying but couldn't prove it until now. Until I'd found the real evidence on grandfather's computer. The next afternoon, I was sitting in the foster home's living room when a car pulled up outside and Carlotta came in to tell me Catherine had arrived. My hands started shaking as I walked to the front door and saw a woman getting out of the car. She was 70 but moved like someone much younger, standing up straight with sharp eyes that took in everything around her. I understood immediately what grandfather had meant about fighter blood, because I saw that same determined look in my own mirror every morning. Catherine walked up the driveway and stopped a few feet away from me, just staring at my face like she was trying to memorize every detail. Then she started crying and reached out to hold my face in her hands, telling me I looked exactly like her daughter did at my age. I didn't know what to say or how to act around this stranger who was technically my grandmother, but felt like someone from a completely different world. We went inside and sat down in the living room while Carlotta and Finn gave us some space. Catherine kept holding my hand and apologizing for not finding me sooner, for not knowing I existed until now. I told her it wasn't her fault, and she squeezed my hand tighter, saying she should have pushed harder, sued more times, never given up even when everyone told her to. She started telling me about my mother as a baby, how her real name was Rebecca Ann Monroe, and she was 6 months old when she disappeared from a shopping mall. Catherine described that day in detail, how she'd only looked away for a second to check a price tag, and when she turned back, the stroller was empty. She'd been thinking about Rebecca every single day for 40 years, never stopped hoping she'd find her daughter alive. Hearing my mother's real name felt strange and powerful, like learning a secret language that connected me to this whole other family history I never knew existed. Detective Bartlett showed up an hour later and asked to speak with Catherine and me together. He sat down across from us looking serious and said they'd located my mother at a place called Millbrook Psychiatric Facility, about 2 hours away. Catherine's hands started shaking so hard I could feel it where she was holding mine, and I realized she was about to see her daughter for the first time in 4 decades. Detective Bartlett explained they'd need to coordinate with the facility and verify some things first, but we could probably visit tomorrow. Catherine asked if Rebecca knew we were coming, and he said no. They wanted to prepare her properly given her condition and the circumstances. That night, I stayed at a hotel with Catherine and Carlotta because Catherine refused to let me go back to the foster home, wanted to keep me close now that she'd finally found me. We ordered room service, but nobody ate much, just picked at our food while Catherine told me more stories about my mother as a baby. She showed me more photos on her phone, pictures she'd been carrying around for years, hoping she'd get to share them with her daughter someday. I fell asleep that night on the hotel room couch listening to Catherine talk about my mother, and for the first time since the basement, I felt almost safe. The next morning, we drove to Millbrook with Detective Bartlett and Carlotta following in their car. Catherine held my hand in the back seat the whole way, squeezing so tight it almost hurt, but I didn't pull away because I could feel how scared she was. I tried to prepare myself for seeing my mother after 12 years of thinking she was dead, tried to imagine what she'd look like now, whether she'd even recognize me. The facility was a big gray building surrounded by fences, and my stomach twisted as we pulled into the parking lot. Catherine took a deep breath and said we were finally going to bring Rebecca home. The facility looked even worse up close than it did from the parking lot. Gray concrete walls stretched up 3 stories with tiny windows covered in metal mesh, and the whole building had this weird smell of cleaning chemicals mixed with something I couldn't identify, but made my stomach hurt. Catherine's grip on my hand got tighter as we walked through the front entrance where a security guard checked our IDs and made us sign in on a clipboard. The lobby had plastic chairs bolted to the floor and fluorescent lights that buzzed, so loud I could barely hear the receptionist when she told us to wait. We sat there for 20 minutes watching other visitors come and go, most of them looking tired and sad in ways that made me wonder what their stories were. Finally, a woman in a blue suit came through the security door and introduced herself as Estelle Norris, the facility administrator. She shook Catherine's hand and gave me this look that was part sympathy and part something else I couldn't read. We followed her down a long hallway with locked doors on both sides, and I noticed the windows here had bars too, even though we were inside. Estelle's office was small and cluttered with file folders stacked on every surface, and she gestured for us to sit in 2 chairs across from her desk while she pulled up something on her computer. She started explaining that my mother had been admitted 12 years ago with a diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia, and I felt Catherine's whole body go rigid next to me. Estelle kept talking in this careful voice about how my mother had been claiming her parents stole her as a baby, and that she had a daughter who didn't exist. Catherine made a sound like someone punched her in the stomach, and I realized she was crying without making any noise, just tears running down her face while she stared at Estelle. The administrator looked uncomfortable now, clicking through screens on her computer and pulling papers from different folders while explaining the admission process. She spread the papers across her desk, and Catherine leaned forward to read them, her hands shaking so bad the papers rattled. Every single form was signed by my grandparents as next of kin with their statements about my mother's delusions and dangerous behavior. There was no independent verification, no second opinion, just my grandparents' word that their daughter was crazy and needed to be locked up. Estelle's face changed as she looked at the papers like she was seeing them for the first time, and she admitted quietly that my mother had been medicated and treated for over a decade, based entirely on what my grandparents told the doctors. Catherine stood up so fast her chair fell over and demanded to see her daughter right now. Estelle held up both hands and started explaining in that same careful voice that 12 years of psychiatric medication and being locked up had done serious damage. My mother might not recognize us or believe we were real, and they'd need to do lots of tests to figure out what could be fixed and what couldn't. Man, Catherine was shaking her head and saying she didn't care. She needed to see Rebecca immediately after 40 years of searching. Estelle made a phone call and told someone to prepare a patient for visitors, then led us to another locked door that required her badge to open. The visiting room was small with a table and 4 chairs, all bolted to the floor like in the lobby. We sat there waiting, and I could hear Catherine breathing too fast like she might pass out. The door opened and a nurse brought my mother in, and I stopped breathing completely. She was so thin I could see the bones in her wrists and face, and her eyes looked empty in a way that scared me more than anything my grandparents ever did. She moved slowly like someone much older than 35, shuffling her feet in slippers that were too big. When she saw Catherine, she stopped walking and just stood there staring. Then she started crying and saying, "You're not real," over and over in this flat voice that didn't match the tears on her face. Catherine stood up slowly and held out her hands but didn't move closer. She started talking in this gentle voice, telling my mother her real name was Rebecca Ann Monroe, and describing things about her childhood that only family would know. She talked about a stuffed rabbit Rebecca loved, and a birthmark on her left shoulder, and the song Catherine used to sing at bedtime. My mother kept shaking her head and backing toward the door like she wanted to run away. She was saying no, 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 but still crying, and the nurse who brought her in stayed by the door watching everything. Catherine kept talking about specific memories and details while moving closer, one tiny step at a time. Then my mother looked at me and something changed in her face. Her eyes focused on me in a way they hadn't focused on Catherine, and she whispered my name like she wasn't sure it was really a word. She reached out one hand toward me but pulled it back before we touched, and she looked terrified like I might disappear if she got too close. I stood up even though my legs felt weird and shaky, and I walked over to her slowly like Catherine had done. I took her hand and it was freezing cold and trembling, so hard I could barely hold it. I told her I was real, and she was right all along about everything, that she wasn't crazy, and they were the ones who lied. She made this sound like all the air left her body at once and collapsed against me sobbing. She grabbed onto my shirt and kept repeating, "They said I imagined you. They said you weren't real. They said I was crazy." I held her while she cried, and Catherine came over and put her arms around both of us. A doctor came in then. Someone Estelle must have called, and he waited until my mother stopped crying enough to listen. He pulled up a chair and started explaining in this serious voice that what my mother thought were delusions were actually real memories trying to surface. They'd been giving her medication for symptoms that were really her mind trying to remember being trafficked as a baby. Catherine looked at him with so much anger I thought she might hit him, and she asked how they could medicate someone for telling the truth. The doctor said the admission papers seemed legitimate at the time, and they had no reason to doubt the family's account. Estelle jumped in and explained that my mother would need lots of therapy, and they'd have to gradually reduce her medications to see what damage could be reversed. She said there was no way to know how much brain function my mother would get back after 12 years of being treated for a condition she didn't have. Catherine demanded they start the process immediately, and threatened to sue everyone if they delayed even one day. Estelle agreed and said they'd begin reassessing my mother's case right away. We stayed with my mother for another hour while she cried and touched my face like she was trying to memorize it. She kept asking if I was really real, and I kept telling her yes. When it was time to leave, she panicked and grabbed my hand so tight it hurt, begging us not to go because she was afraid we'd disappear. Catherine promised we'd come back tomorrow and every day after that until we could take her home. The nurse had to help separate my mother from me, and watching her being led back through that locked door was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. We drove back to the hotel in silence except for Catherine crying in the passenger seat. That night, I couldn't sleep thinking about my mother in that place for 12 years, locked up and medicated because my grandparents wanted to hide their crimes. The next morning, we went back to visit and my mother seemed slightly better, more present somehow. She still kept asking if we were real, but she believed us faster when we said yes. Catherine brought photos on her phone and showed my mother pictures of herself as a baby, and my mother stared at them for a long time before saying she remembered some of it. We came back every single day that week, and each time my mother seemed a little more like an actual person. She'd remember things from our last visit and ask questions about what happened while she was locked up. But she also had moments where she'd suddenly seem confused about where she was, or who we were, like her brain would just stop working right in the middle of a conversation. The doctor started reducing her medications slowly, and doing tests to figure out what parts of her mind might recover. Catherine hired Finn to work with the facility on getting my mother released, and he warned us it could take months because of all the legal issues. By the end of that first week, my mother could have whole conversations without getting confused, and she cried when Catherine told her she could come live with us once the doctors cleared her. She looked at me and said she was sorry for not protecting me from them, and I told her it wasn't her fault because they fooled everyone. We got back from the psychiatric facility and spent 2 days just trying to process everything before the next wave hit. Finn called Catherine's cell while we were eating breakfast and she put him on speaker, so I could hear too. He explained that the prosecutor assigned to my grandparents' case wanted to meet with us to go over the charges and what would happen next. Catherine asked when, and Finn said tomorrow afternoon if we could make it, which we could because neither of us was doing anything except visiting my mother and trying to figure out how to be a family. The next day, we drove to the county courthouse and met Prosecutor Lucian Meyer in a conference room that smelled like old coffee and had walls covered in legal books nobody probably ever read. He was maybe 40 with tired eyes and a way of talking that made everything sound serious without being scary. He shook both our hands and told us to sit down, then spread out a folder full of papers across the table between us. The charges against my grandparents filled 3 whole pages, and he went through them one by one so we'd understand what each meant. Kidnapping me, child abuse, conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, and potentially federal trafficking charges related to my mother's illegal adoption 40 years ago. Catherine's hands shook while she listened, and I kept mine folded in my lap, so nobody would see them doing the same thing. Lucian explained that the recorded confession on my phone was incredibly strong evidence, but they were also building cases around the email chains, the adoption papers, the life insurance policy, and the psychiatric facility records showing how my grandparents had my mother committed under false pretenses. He said my grandparents were currently being held without bail because the judge considered them flight risks given their age and the severity of the charges. Catherine asked how long the trial would take, and Lucian said it depended on whether they took a plea deal or insisted on going to trial, but either way we were looking at months, not weeks. He warned us that I'd probably have to testify at some point, and Catherine immediately asked if that was absolutely necessary, because I'd already been through enough. Lucian looked at me directly and said he understood this was hard, but my testimony about the basement imprisonment and the breakfast confrontation would be crucial for the jury to understand the full scope of what my grandparents had done. The meeting lasted almost 2 hours, and by the end my brain felt stuffed with legal terms and procedures I barely understood. We drove back to the hotel, and Catherine ordered pizza for dinner because neither of us had the energy to go anywhere or cook anything. While we ate, her phone rang again, and this time it was someone from the insurance company investigating the life insurance policy my grandparents had taken out on me. Catherine answered and put it on speaker like she had with Finn, and the investigator introduced himself before diving straight into questions about when my grandparents had first mentioned the policy, and whether I knew anything about it before finding the documents in grandfather's office. I told him I had no idea it existed until that day, and he made a note of that before explaining what his investigation had uncovered. The policy was taken out 3 years ago, right after my grandparents' medical bills started piling up from grandmother's hip replacement and grandfather's heart medication. The investigator said the timing was suspicious, and when combined with the emails about selling me to the facilitator, it painted a clear picture of premeditation. They'd been planning this for years, just waiting for the right moment when their financial desperation got bad enough that they could justify it to themselves. The investigator asked more questions about my grandparents' financial situation, and whether I'd noticed them talking about money problems, which I hadn't because they always acted like everything was fine. He thanked us for our time and said the insurance company would be cooperating fully with the criminal investigation and would likely file their own fraud charges. Catherine hung up and just sat there staring at her pizza like she'd forgotten what food was for. 3 days later, Finn called again with news that he'd filed emergency custody papers on Catherine's behalf. He explained that since Catherine was my mother's biological mother, that made her my legal next of kin, and she should have guardianship of me instead of me staying in foster care. The court had appointed someone named Cyril Hansen as my guardian ad litem, which Finn explained meant he was a lawyer whose only job was to make sure my interests were protected during the custody proceedings. Cyril wanted to meet with me as soon as possible to talk about what I wanted and needed, and Finn had set up an appointment for the next morning. Catherine asked if she should come to the meeting, and Finn said probably not for the first one because Cyril needed to talk to me alone to make sure I wasn't being pressured or influenced by anyone. That made sense, but also made my stomach hurt because talking to another stranger about everything that happened felt exhausting. The next morning, Carlotta drove me to Cyril's office, which was in a building downtown with elevators that moved. So slowly I thought we'd be stuck forever. Cyril was older than I expected, maybe 60, with gray hair and glasses that kept sliding down his nose. He had me sit in a comfortable chair across from his desk and offered me water or soda, which I declined because I just wanted to get this over with. He started by explaining his role and making it clear that he worked for me, not for Catherine or the court or anyone else, and that everything I told him would stay between us unless I gave permission to share it. Then he asked what I wanted to happen with custody and where I wanted to live. I told him I wanted to live with Catherine because she was the only family I had left who wasn't either locked up or institutionalized, but I was also scared of trusting another grandparent after what mine had done to me. He nodded and wrote that down before asking what would make me feel safer about living with Catherine. I said I needed to know my mother would be okay, even if she never fully recovered from 12 years of being medicated for a condition she didn't have, and that I needed Catherine to understand I might not be able to trust her right away, even though I wanted to. Cyril asked more questions about my relationship with Catherine so far, and what my concerns were about moving in with her permanently. I admitted I was worried she might change once I lived with her, that the nice grandmother act might be temporary like my other grandparents had been before they locked me in the basement. He asked if Catherine had done anything specific to make me worry about that, and I said no, but trauma makes you suspicious of everyone even when they haven't done anything wrong. He seemed to understand that, and didn't push me to feel differently, just kept asking questions and taking notes. The interview lasted almost 3 hours and covered everything from my daily routine to my nightmares to what kind of support I thought I'd need to feel safe in a new home. By the end, I felt wrung out but also lighter somehow, like saying everything out loud to someone whose job was just to listen had released some pressure I didn't know I was carrying. 2 weeks after I ran out of my grandparents' house, the custody hearing happened in a courtroom that felt too big and formal for what was basically deciding where I'd sleep at night. Catherine sat with Finn at one table, while Cyril sat with me at another, and the judge was a woman with sharp eyes who looked at me like she was trying to see through my skin to the truth underneath. Cyril presented his recommendation that Catherine receive temporary guardianship based on the evidence of my grandparents' abuse, Catherine's biological relationship to my mother, and my stated preference to live with her. The judge asked me directly if I understood what this meant, and if I was sure this was what I wanted, and I said yes, even though my voice shook. She asked a few more questions about my mother's condition, and Catherine's ability to care for me, while also supporting my mother's recovery. Catherine answered calmly and clearly, explaining that she had the financial resources and emotional capacity to handle both responsibilities. The judge looked at all the documents Finn had submitted, then looked at me again before announcing that she was granting Catherine temporary guardianship for 6 months, after which we'd reconvene to assess whether permanent guardianship was appropriate. She said this was in my best interest given the circumstances, and that she'd be monitoring the situation closely to ensure my safety and well-being. Just like that, it was decided. I was moving in with Catherine 3 states away, leaving behind the only home I'd ever known, even though that home had turned into a prison. Catherine's house was nothing like my grandparents' place. It was full of windows that let in light from every direction, and the walls were covered in photos of people I didn't recognize but who must have been family. The furniture was comfortable instead of formal, the kind you could actually sit on without worrying about messing it up. Catherine showed me around slowly, pointing out the kitchen where she liked to cook, and the living room with bookshelves that went floor to ceiling. Then she took me upstairs to a bedroom that overlooked the backyard, and when she opened the door, I saw it was decorated for someone who wasn't there. The walls were painted soft yellow, and there was a bed with a handmade quilt, a desk by the window, and shelves with books and stuffed animals that looked like they'd been waiting decades for someone to play with them. Catherine's voice got quiet when she explained this was the room she kept ready for my mother all these years, never giving up hope that she'd find her daughter and bring her home. She said I could stay in this room or choose a different one if I wanted, but she thought maybe my mother would like knowing I was here in the space she'd held for her. I touched the quilt and felt tears coming, but pushed them back down because I'd cried enough for one lifetime. I told Catherine this room was perfect, and she hugged me carefully, like she was afraid I might break. Starting at a new school in November was awkward in ways I hadn't expected. Everyone already had their friend groups and inside jokes and established routines, and I was just the random new girl who showed up halfway through fall semester for no apparent reason. Catherine drove me on the first day and walked me to the office to get my schedule, but she didn't push me to explain anything to anyone. She'd told me before that I could tell people whatever I was comfortable with about why I transferred mid-semester, which was usually just that I was living with my grandmother now. Nobody asked too many questions because teenagers are mostly focused on their own problems, not some stranger's mysterious backstory. The classes were different from my old school, and I spent the first week just trying to figure out where everything was and what the teachers expected. At lunch, I sat alone in the cafeteria with a book, because that seemed less pathetic than sitting alone without one. A few people tried to be friendly in that surface-level way where they smile and say hi, but don't actually want to know you, and I smiled back and said hi, and left it at that. Catherine asked how school was going every day after she picked me up, and I gave her the standard fine, even though fine was a massive overstatement. By the second week, I'd figured out the basic geography of the building and which teachers would accept late homework without penalty. By the third week, I'd stopped expecting anyone to talk to me and had settled into being invisible, which was honestly a relief after everything that happened. The nightmares started around week 3 of living with Catherine. I'd be back in the basement with the motion sensors shrieking every time I moved, or my grandparents would be standing over my mattress explaining calmly why they needed to kill me, or I'd see my mother's hollow eyes staring at me from the psychiatric facility while she whispered that I wasn't real. I'd wake up sweating and gasping, convinced I was still trapped in that basement, or that everything since had been a dream, and I'd wake up to find grandfather unlocking the door for another inspection. One night, I woke up crying hard enough that Catherine heard me from her room down the hall. She knocked softly and asked if she could come in, and I said yes, because I was too scared to be alone. She sat on the edge of my bed and didn't try to fix anything or tell me it would be okay, just stayed there while I cried, and occasionally handed me tissues from the box on the nightstand. We sat like that until dawn started showing through the curtains, and Catherine never once acted like this was an inconvenience or something I should get over. She just stayed present while I fell apart, which was somehow more helpful than any advice or comfort could have been. A few days after the nightmare incident, Carlotta called to say she'd arranged for me to see a therapist who specialized in trauma and family violence. The therapist's name was Dr. Beryl Schwartz, and her office was 20 minutes from Catherine's house in a building that tried too hard to look welcoming with its bright colors and inspirational posters. Beryl was maybe 50 with short gray hair and a direct way of talking that I appreciated after weeks of people tiptoeing around me. She didn't waste time with small talk, just asked what brought me in and listened while I gave her the abbreviated version of my grandparents trying to sell me and my mother being institutionalized for 12 years. She took notes, but also maintained eye contact in a way that made me feel like she was actually listening instead of just waiting for her turn to talk. When I finished, she explained that what I was experiencing was completely normal for someone who survived what I did. The nightmares, the hypervigilance, the difficulty trusting people, the sudden crying episodes, all of it was my brain's way of processing trauma. She said healing wasn't linear or quick, that I'd have good days and sometimes good hours followed by bad hours. She asked what coping mechanisms I currently used, and I admitted I mostly just tried not to think about it, which she said was understandable but not sustainable long term. We spent the rest of the session talking about grounding techniques and how to recognize when I was getting triggered before I completely spiraled. She gave me homework, which felt weird for therapy, but made sense when she explained it was about practicing the skills we discussed. I left feeling slightly less broken than when I arrived, which seemed like progress. That same week, my mother was transferred to a different psychiatric facility that specialized in trauma recovery rather than long-term institutionalization. The new place was an hour away from Catherine's house instead of 2, which meant we could visit more often without it taking up the entire day. Catherine and I started going twice a week, usually Tuesday and Thursday afternoons after I got out of school. The new facility looked more like a regular medical building than a psychiatric hospital, with actual windows and common areas that didn't feel like prisons. My mother had her own room instead of sharing with 3 other patients, and the staff treated her like a person capable of recovery, rather than someone who needed to be managed and medicated into compliance. The first few visits, she was still shaky and uncertain, asking repeatedly if we were real and if we'd come back. But slowly, visit by visit, she started to seem more like an actual person and less like a ghost. She'd remember things from our last conversation and ask follow-up questions, which sounds like such a small thing but felt huge after years of her not remembering I existed at all. She started talking about wanting to learn things again, maybe take classes or read books that weren't approved by facility staff. Catherine brought her magazines and novels, and my mother would tell us about them during our next visit, excited about plot twists and characters like she was discovering reading for the first time. One Thursday, she asked about my school, and actually listened to my answer, even laughed when I told her about the teacher who couldn't figure out how to unmute himself during online attendance. These tiny moments of normalcy felt like miracles after everything we'd been through. During the next Thursday visit, my mother sat across from me in the facility's common room with her hands folded on the table. She looked more present than usual, her eyes focused instead of that distant, medicated stare I'd gotten used to. She started talking about books, about a chapter she'd just finished, then stopped mid-sentence and looked at me really carefully. She said she remembered teaching me to read before they took her away. She remembered sitting with me on a blue couch, pointing at words in picture books, watching my face light up when I figured out a new word. She remembered my 4th birthday party with the homemade cake that had wonky frosting, and 4 candles I couldn't blow out all at once. She remembered the stuffed elephant I carried everywhere, the one with the torn ear that I refused to let anyone fix because I said it made him special. Her voice got quieter as she talked, like she was afraid speaking too loud would make the memories disappear again. Then she started crying, not the hollow mechanical tears from earlier visits, but real sobbing that shook her whole body. She said the doctors told her those memories were delusions, that she'd invented a daughter because she was sick and broken. They made her repeat over and over that I wasn't real, that her memories were symptoms of her disease. She'd spent 12 years thinking her brain had created me, that every memory of holding me and teaching me and loving me was just her mind playing tricks. Catherine reached across the table and held her hand while she cried, and I sat there feeling like someone had punched all the air out of my chest. My mother had remembered me the whole time, had fought to hold on to those memories while doctors and medication tried to erase them, and she'd been alone with that for 12 years. The preliminary hearing happened on a freezing December morning at the county courthouse downtown. Catherine drove me there early because Carlotta said we needed time to prepare before going into the courtroom. The building was old with high ceilings and marble floors that made every sound echo, and I felt sick the moment we walked through the metal detectors. Prosecutor Meyer met us in a small conference room and went over what I'd need to testify about, what questions the defense attorney might ask, how to stay calm if I got upset on the stand. He was matter-of-fact about it, explaining the process like he was giving directions somewhere, which somehow made it less scary than if he'd been overly nice. When we finally walked into the courtroom, I saw my grandparents sitting at the defense table in orange jumpsuits with a guard standing behind them. Grandmother looked smaller than I remembered, her face pale without makeup, her hands folded on the table in front of her. Grandfather sat perfectly still with that same blank expression he used to have when he was angry but pretending not to be. Seeing them in those orange suits with chains on their wrists made my stomach flip, not because I felt sorry for them, but because it made everything real in a way it hadn't been before. The judge called my name and I walked to the witness stand with my legs shaking so hard I thought everyone could see. I put my hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, then sat down and looked at Prosecutor Meyer instead of at my grandparents. He asked me to describe the basement imprisonment and I told him about the motion sensors and the locked door and the 4 a.m. inspections. He asked about the breakfast confrontation, and I described spreading the papers on the table and recording their confession. My voice stayed steady even though my hands were gripping the armrests, so tight my fingers went numb. The defense attorney asked me questions too, trying to make it sound like I'd misunderstood or exaggerated, but I just kept telling the truth clearly and completely like Prosecutor Meyer had coached me to do. During the break, I was standing in the hallway with Catherine when my grandmother appeared next to us with her attorney and the guard. She looked at me with those same eyes that used to watch me eat cookies in her kitchen, and she called me Precious Angel in that sweet voice she used to use. She said she knew I was confused and scared, but we could fix this if I just told the judge I'd made a mistake. Catherine stepped between us so fast I barely saw her move, putting herself physically in front of me like a wall. She told my grandmother in a voice I'd never heard her use before that she would never speak to me again, that she'd lost the right to call me anything when she decided to sell me like property. The bailiff started moving toward us to escort my grandparents away, and that's when grandmother's mask cracked again. She started screaming that I was ungrateful, that they'd raised me and fed me and given me everything, that I was destroying their final years over nothing. Her voice got higher and louder as the bailiff pulled her backward down the hall, echoing off the marble floors while other people in the courthouse stopped and stared. Grandfather didn't say anything, just looked at me with this cold expression that made me understand he'd never actually loved me at all. Catherine kept her arm around my shoulders until they were gone, and I realized I was shaking so hard my teeth were chattering even though the courthouse was warm. That afternoon, Finn came to Catherine's house to talk about the case. He sat at the kitchen table with papers spread out in front of him, explaining that my grandparents' attorney was trying to negotiate a plea deal to avoid going to trial. He said the attorney was arguing that my grandparents were elderly and confused, that they'd never actually hurt me, that the whole thing was a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. But Prosecutor Meyer was pushing for maximum sentences given the severity and duration of their crimes, not just what they'd done to me, but the trafficking of my mother 40 years ago, and her 12 years of false imprisonment in the psychiatric facility. Finn said the case could go to trial if they didn't accept the prosecution's terms, which would mean more hearings and more testimony and months of waiting for resolution. He asked how I felt about that possibility, whether I was prepared to testify again in a full trial if it came to that. I told him I'd do whatever it took to make sure they couldn't hurt anyone else, that I wasn't scared of telling the truth even if it meant facing them in court again. Catherine squeezed my hand under the table and told Finn to let Prosecutor Meyer know we'd support whatever approach gave the strongest chance of conviction and the longest sentences. Finn made notes on his papers and said he'd relay that message, then started packing up his files. Before he left, he told me I was handling this with remarkable strength for someone my age, but I didn't feel strong. I felt tired and angry and like I wanted this to be over, so I could stop thinking about them every single day. That night, Catherine asked if I wanted to learn about my real family history. We sat in her living room with photo albums and documents spread across the coffee table, and she started telling me about my mother's childhood before she was stolen. She showed me pictures of my mother as a baby with dark curls and a smile that looked exactly like mine, surrounded by family at birthday parties and holidays and ordinary days. She told me about extended family I never knew existed, aunts and uncles and cousins who'd mourned when my mother disappeared and who'd been part of Catherine's search all these years. She explained cultural traditions my grandparents had erased, holidays we should have celebrated together, recipes and stories and history that were mine by blood, but had been stolen along with everything else. I looked at pictures of family gatherings I should have been part of, saw my face reflected in the faces of relatives I'd never met, and understood for the first time that I wasn't just a trafficking victim. I was part of something bigger than the small, isolated world my grandparents had created, part of a family with roots and stories and people who'd wanted me before they even knew I existed. Catherine showed me a family tree she'd maintained all these years with my mother's name, and a blank space below it labeled Rebecca's daughter, waiting for the day she'd finally know who I was. She traced the lines with her finger, showing me how I connected to dozens of people who shared my blood and my history, and I felt something shift inside me. I wasn't alone anymore. Wasn't just the granddaughter of 2 criminals who'd tried to sell me. I was part of something real and permanent that no one could take away. For Christmas, Catherine gave me a photo album she'd been making since the day she found me. The cover was simple, dark blue leather with my name embossed in gold letters, and when I opened it, I saw my mother's baby pictures carefully arranged on the first pages. There were photos of family gatherings from before my mother was stolen, everyone smiling and unaware of what was coming. Then there were pages of empty spaces with handwritten labels, Rebecca's daughter's first day of school, and Rebecca's daughter's 10th birthday, and Rebecca's daughter learning to drive. Catherine had left those spaces blank all these years, holding on to hope that someday she'd know my name and have actual pictures to fill them with. The later pages had recent photos, pictures Catherine had taken of me and my mother at the psychiatric facility, of me and her at the house, of the 3 of us together. She'd written captions under each one with the dates and details, creating the record of my life that should have existed all along. The last page had a note in Catherine's handwriting that said she never stopped believing we'd all be together someday, that every empty space in this album was an act of faith that the truth would eventually surface. I sat on her couch crying while looking through the pages, understanding that someone had been waiting for me my entire life, that I'd been wanted and missed and searched for even when I didn't know it. Catherine sat next to me and said this was just the beginning of building the life we should have had, that we'd fill dozens more albums together with real memories and real family and real love. In January, my mother was released from the psychiatric facility to a supervised group home across town. The doctor said 12 years of institutionalization had destroyed many of her daily living skills, that she'd need intensive therapy and support to learn how to function independently again. The group home was a regular house in a quiet neighborhood where 6 people lived together with staff support, learning or relearning how to cook and clean and manage money and navigate the world outside institutions. Catherine and I helped her move in on a cold Saturday morning, carrying boxes of new clothes and books and basic supplies up to her small bedroom on the 2nd floor. My mother kept touching everything like she couldn't believe it was real, running her hands over the bedspread and the curtains and the dresser drawers. She asked the staff member showing us around if she was really allowed to close her bedroom door, if she could really choose when to wake up and what to eat and whether to join group activities. The staff member explained gently that yes, this was her space and her life now, that the whole point of the group home was helping her rebuild autonomy and independence. My mother sat on her new bed and cried, and I understood she was crying because for the first time in 12 years, she had choices about her own life. Our first visit to the group home the following week was harder than I expected. My mother had cleaned her room obsessively and was wearing carefully matched clothes with her hair brushed smooth, sitting stiffly on the couch in the common area when we arrived. She asked us how we were doing in this bright, fake voice, laughed at things that weren't funny, kept adjusting her posture like she was graded on how normal she could act. Everything about her seemed rehearsed and performed, like she was playing the part of a recovered person, instead of actually being one. Catherine watched her for a few minutes, then sat down next to her and said gently that she didn't have to perform for us, that we weren't doctors or staff members evaluating her progress. My mother's fake smile cracked and she started crying, saying she didn't know how to be a person anymore. She said she'd spent 12 years learning to act sane according to other people's definitions, to say the right things and show the right emotions and suppress anything that might be labeled as symptoms. Now she was supposed to just be herself, but she didn't know who that was anymore or how to figure it out. She said every interaction felt like a test she might fail. Every emotion felt dangerous because what if it was the wrong one? Catherine held her while she sobbed and told her it was okay to not know, that she had time to figure out who she was now and we'd be here through all of it. The next day, I had a therapy session with Beryl and I told her about the group home visit and how broken my mother seemed. Beryl listened carefully, then explained that my mother might never fully recover the years that were stolen from her, that 12 years of psychiatric abuse and inappropriate medication had done real lasting damage. She said it wasn't my fault that my mother was struggling, and it wasn't my responsibility to fix her or make her healing happen faster. I could love her and support her recovery without making her healing my job, without feeling guilty every time she had a bad day or struggled with something that should be simple. Beryl said the healthiest thing I could do was maintain boundaries. show up for my mother when I had the capacity, but also take care of my own needs and my own healing. She reminded me that I was still a teenager who'd survived my own trauma, that I deserved to focus on my own life and future, instead of spending all my energy trying to save my mother from the damage that had already been done. It was hard to hear, but also relieving in a way, like getting permission to not be responsible for fixing everything. In late January, Catherine got a call from an insurance investigator who'd been looking into the life insurance policy my grandparents had taken out on me. The investigator explained that the insurance company was voiding the policy and launching their own investigation into my grandparents' history. They'd discovered that my grandparents had committed insurance fraud multiple times over the years, taking out policies on people and then filing suspicious claims, collecting payouts on deaths or disappearances that happened under questionable circumstances. The investigator said they'd found at least 4 other cases where my grandparents had profited from insurance policies, though none of the previous cases had been investigated thoroughly at the time. Now all of those cases were being reopened, and the insurance fraud charges were being added to the criminal case my grandparents already faced. Catherine listened to the investigator's explanation with her jaw tight, then thanked him for the information and hung up. She looked at me and said she wasn't surprised, that people who would traffic their own daughter and try to sell their granddaughter were clearly capable of anything. But hearing about other victims, other people my grandparents had hurt or killed for money, made me feel sick in a new way. I'd thought I understood how evil they were, but apparently I'd only scratched the surface. In February, Prosecutor Meyer called Catherine with news about the plea deal. My grandparents had finally agreed to terms rather than risk trial. Grandfather got 20 years for kidnapping, child abuse, and conspiracy to commit murder. Grandmother got 18 years for the same charges plus insurance fraud. Catherine repeated the numbers to me while I sat at her kitchen table and I did the math in my head. They were 78 years old. These were life sentences. They'd die in prison. The thought should have made me feel something, but I just sat there staring at my cereal getting soggy. Catherine asked if I was okay, and I nodded, but I wasn't sure what okay was supposed to feel like anymore. The sentencing hearing happened 3 weeks later on a cold Tuesday morning. Catherine, my mother, and I drove to the courthouse together. My mother held my hand in the back seat, her palm clammy and shaking. She'd been doing better lately, but courtrooms made her anxious. Too many years of being dragged to commitment hearings where people decided she was crazy. The courthouse had metal detectors and guards with bored expressions. We went through security and found seats in the gallery behind the prosecutor's table. My grandparents were already there in orange jumpsuits, sitting with their public defender. Grandmother's hair looked greasy and flat without her usual styling. Grandfather's shoulders were hunched forward like he'd shrunk. They looked old and small and pathetic. When grandmother turned around and saw me, her face transformed. She smiled that sweet grandma smile I used to trust, and mouthed, "Precious angel," at me. My stomach twisted. Catherine put her arm around my shoulders and blocked grandmother's view of me. Grandfather just stared straight ahead with his jaw clenched tight. The judge read out the charges and the agreed sentences. Grandfather got 20 years. Grandmother got 18. The judge asked if they had anything to say before sentencing. Grandfather stood up slowly and turned to glare directly at me. His eyes were hard and mean. No pretense of love anymore. He didn't say anything, but the look said enough. Grandmother started crying, loud, dramatic sobs that echoed through the courtroom. She talked about medical bills and how expensive prison healthcare was, and how she'd die alone without proper treatment. She said her arthritis was terrible and she needed special medication. Not one word about what they'd done to me or my mother. Not one word of actual remorse. Just complaints about how their consequences would inconvenience them. The judge looked disgusted and told them to sit down. He signed the sentencing papers, and that was it. My grandparents were let out through a side door. Grandmother was still crying about her medical expenses. Grandfather glanced back one more time with that same hateful glare. Then they were gone. We left the courthouse and nobody said much. My mother was shaking worse than before, gripping my hand so tight it hurt. Catherine suggested getting lunch somewhere quiet. We ended up at a little restaurant near the courthouse that served soup and sandwiches. The place was mostly empty, just us and a couple other tables. We sat in a corner booth and my mother finally let go of my hand. She ordered tea but didn't drink it, just wrapped her hands around the warm cup. Catherine ordered for all of us because I couldn't focus on the menu. When the food came, my mother picked at her sandwich and then suddenly looked at me with clear eyes. She reached across the table and took my hand again, gentler this time. She said she was proud of me for being brave enough to expose the truth. Her voice was quiet but steady, more present than I'd heard her sound in months. She said most people would have stayed silent out of fear, but I'd chosen to speak up even when it was terrifying. Catherine squeezed my other hand and said we were all brave, that we'd survived something horrible together. I started crying into my soup and they let me cry without trying to fix it. A week later, Finn showed up at Catherine's house with papers about a civil lawsuit. He explained that Catherine wanted to sue my grandparents for damages related to my mother's kidnapping and my abuse. My grandparents didn't have money, so this wasn't really about getting paid. It was about creating an official legal record of exactly what they'd done and the harm they'd caused. documentation that would exist forever in court records, proof that couldn't be denied or rewritten. I asked if I'd have to testify again, and Finn said probably not, that the criminal case evidence would support the civil claims. Catherine signed the papers, and Finn took them away to file with the court. It felt strange to think about my grandparents in prison getting served with more legal papers, but also kind of satisfying. They'd spent decades hiding their crimes, and now everything was documented and made official. Winter started turning into spring, and I noticed I felt different at Catherine's house. Not completely safe, but safer. I still checked every night that my bedroom door locked from the inside. Sometimes I woke up in the middle of the night convinced I was back in the basement, heart racing and hands shaking until I remembered where I actually was. But those panic attacks were happening less often. Dr. Schwartz said this was normal healing, that trauma doesn't disappear overnight. She said my brain was slowly learning to feel secure again after months of being in danger. Some mornings I woke up and didn't immediately think about my grandparents. Some days I went to the school and focused on homework instead of replaying everything in my head. Progress was slow and uneven, but it was happening. My mother started coming to dinner at Catherine's house every Sunday. At first she was quiet and withdrawn, eating quickly and leaving as soon as politely possible. But gradually she stayed longer. She started asking me questions about school, and actually listened to my answers. She remembered things I'd told her the previous week and brought them up again. She laughed at Catherine's jokes, real laughs instead of that hollow, medicated sound. One Sunday she helped me with my algebra homework and explained concepts in a way that actually made sense. Catherine watched us working together with tears in her eyes. Later she told me it was the first time in 40 years she'd seen her daughter act like a mother, and it gave her hope that healing was possible for all of us. In late March, Catherine enrolled me in a support group for teenage trafficking survivors. It met every Wednesday evening at a community center downtown. I didn't want to go at first because talking about what happened with strangers sounded horrible. But Catherine said hearing other people's stories might help me feel less alone. The first meeting I sat in the back and didn't say anything. There were 8 other teenagers there, all different ages and backgrounds. They talked about being sold by family members, about being promised good jobs that turned into captivity, about escaping and trying to rebuild normal lives. Their stories were different from mine in the details, but the same in the ways that mattered. The fear, the betrayal, the confusion about how the people who were supposed to protect you could hurt you instead. After the 3rd meeting, I started talking a little. After the 5th meeting, I realized I didn't feel so weird and broken anymore. What happened to me and my mother was part of a bigger pattern. We weren't alone, even though it had felt isolating for so long. In April, my mother's therapist called Catherine with good news. My mother had made enough progress to have unsupervised visits with me. No more staff members hovering nearby. No more structured visiting rooms. Just us spending time together like a normal mother and daughter. Catherine drove me to the group home on a Saturday afternoon and left us alone for 2 hours. My mother had set up her room with photos and books, making it feel more like home than an institution. We sat on her bed looking through photo albums Catherine had given her. Pictures of my mother as a baby before she was stolen. Pictures of me as a little kid that my grandparents had taken, back when they were still pretending to be normal grandparents. My mother told me stories about my early childhood, things she remembered from before they took her away. She said I used to refuse to wear shoes and would hide them all over the house. She said I was obsessed with elephants and made her read the same elephant book every night for months. Hearing these memories made them feel real again, instead of like dreams I'd imagined. During our next visit, my mother got quiet and serious. She said she felt guilty that I'd grown up with the people who trafficked her. She said she should have protected me, but they'd convinced everyone she was crazy, so nobody listened. Her voice cracked and she started crying, saying she'd failed me as a mother. I grabbed her hands and told her it wasn't her fault. I said they were master manipulators who'd fooled everyone for decades. I said they'd stolen her entire life, and then used that theft to hurt me too, and none of that was because of anything she did or didn't do. I told her she'd been their victim just like me, maybe even more because they'd taken 40 years from her. She cried harder and hugged me tight, saying she was trying so hard to be a good mother now, even though she didn't always know how. I told her she was doing great, and I meant it. The civil lawsuit settled in May. Finn called Catherine with the news that my grandparents had agreed to sign over everything they owned. The house, their savings accounts, their possessions, all of it. The assets would be split between Catherine for my mother's ongoing care and a trust fund for my future education and living expenses. Finn warned us it wasn't much money because my grandparents had spent most of their savings on lawyers and living expenses before their arrest. The house needed repairs and probably wouldn't sell for much. But it was something. More importantly, it was acknowledgement. Legal documentation that they'd harmed us and owed us compensation. The settlement papers listed every crime they'd committed and every way those crimes had damaged our lives. It would exist in court records forever. Proof of what they'd done that nobody could erase or deny. Catherine picked us up early on a Saturday morning in late May. My mother sat in the back seat gripping her purse so tight her knuckles went white. We drove for almost 3 hours to a neighborhood I'd never seen before, full of old houses with big yards and trees lining every street. Catherine pulled up in front of a blue house with white shutters and cut the engine. My mother stared out the window without moving. This was where she'd lived before they took her. The current owners had planted different flowers in the front garden and painted the shutters a lighter shade, but the bones of the house were the same. My mother opened the car door slowly and walked up to the edge of the lawn. She stood there looking at the house like she was trying to make a memory solid instead of just shadows and fragments. Catherine walked over and stood beside her without saying anything. I stayed by the car, giving them space. My mother started crying after a few minutes. Not loud sobs, but quiet tears that just kept coming. She told Catherine she remembered a swing set in the backyard and a tree she used to climb. She remembered a yellow bedroom with stars on the ceiling. Catherine wrapped her arms around my mother, and they stood there on the front lawn, while 40 years of grief finally had somewhere to go. A woman came out of the house looking confused and a little worried about two strangers crying on her property. Catherine explained quickly that her daughter used to live here as a baby before she was stolen. The woman's face changed completely, and she invited us inside to look around. The layout was different now, with walls knocked down and rooms repainted. But my mother walked through, slowly touching door frames and looking at corners like she was trying to match what she saw with what she remembered. The woman showed us the backyard, and there was still a big oak tree even though the swing set was long gone. My mother walked over to the tree and put her hand on the bark. She said she could almost remember her father pushing her on a swing while Catherine watched from the porch. We stayed for about an hour before my mother said she was ready to leave. She thanked the homeowner and we drove back in silence. My mother fell asleep in the back seat with her head against the window. At the school, things started getting better as the weather warmed up. My grades climbed from barely passing to solid B's, and even a few A's in classes where I actually paid attention. I joined the debate team in April because my English teacher kept bugging me about it, and I needed an extracurricular activity that didn't involve therapy or court dates. The first meeting was awkward because everyone already knew each other from previous years, but the coach paired me with a junior named Maya who didn't ask questions about where I'd transferred from or why I joined so late. We practiced arguing both sides of topics like school uniforms and voting age, and it felt good to focus on something that had nothing to do with my real life. Maya invited me to sit with her friend group at lunch sometimes, and they were normal teenagers who complained about homework and talked about movies and didn't know anything about trafficking or psychiatric facilities or grandparents who bought children. Being around them made me feel like maybe I could be a regular person sometimes, instead of always being the girl with the horrible backstory. I made friends with two other kids from debate team who lived near Catherine's house, and we started studying together at the library on Thursdays. They knew I lived with my grandmother, but they didn't know why, and I liked having that separation between my trauma and my daily life. In early June, my mother's treatment team had a big meeting to discuss her progress. Catherine and I sat in a conference room at the group home while doctors and social workers talked about how much my mother had improved over the past few months. They said she was ready to move to a supervised apartment program, where she'd have her own space but still get regular check-ins and support. The apartment would be about 20 minutes from Catherine's house in a building specifically for people transitioning out of institutional care. Catherine and I helped my mother move in on a Saturday in mid-June. The apartment was small but clean, with a bedroom, bathroom, kitchen area, and living room all in one open space. My mother had almost no possessions after 12 years in facilities, so we went shopping and bought her dishes, towels, bedding, and basic furniture. She picked out everything carefully, like she couldn't quite believe she got to make her own choices about what color towels to buy or which coffee maker to get. We set up her bed and hung curtains and stocked her kitchen with groceries. My mother kept touching things like she needed to make sure they were real. She arranged her few photos on a shelf and organized her small collection of books. When we finished, she sat on her new couch and cried happy tears. This was her first space that was truly hers in over a decade. The next week, my mother called and asked if I'd come visit her at the apartment, just the two of us without Catherine or therapists or anyone else watching. I said yes and took the bus over after school on a Wednesday. She'd made dinner, some kind of pasta dish she said she remembered from before. We ate at her tiny kitchen table, and it felt weird and nice at the same time. After dinner, she asked if I'd come back every week, so we could work on rebuilding our relationship without doctors taking notes on everything we said. I agreed, and we decided Wednesday nights would be our time. She started teaching me recipes she remembered from her childhood, things Catherine used to make. We'd cook together and talk about regular stuff like school and friends, but sometimes she'd share memories that were coming back clearer now that she wasn't medicated into fog. She told me about my first steps and my first words, and the way I used to refuse to sleep unless she sang a specific song. Hearing these stories made me feel connected to a past I'd thought was completely lost. My therapy appointment in late June brought unexpected good news. Beryl told me I'd made significant progress over the past several months, and we could reduce our sessions from every week to every other week. She said I was developing better coping skills and showing fewer trauma symptoms. I realized she was right, because I'd been sleeping through most nights without nightmares. Some days I went hours without thinking about the basement or what my grandparents had tried to do. The panic attacks were less frequent and less intense. I still had hard days where everything felt overwhelming, but they were farther apart now, and I was getting better at managing them when they happened. Beryl said this was normal healing, and I shouldn't expect to be completely fine all at once, but the improvement was real and measurable. Leaving her office that day, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe hope, or maybe just the absence of constant fear. Catherine filed adoption papers in early July to make our relationship legally official. The court date arrived on a hot Thursday morning, and we dressed up and drove to the courthouse together. My mother met us there looking nervous but determined. The hearing was short and straightforward since Child Protective Services and my guardian both supported the adoption. The judge asked me if this was what I wanted, and I said yes without hesitation. Catherine was my grandmother, my family, the person who'd fought for 40 years to find us and bring us home. Making it legal just matched what was already true in every way that mattered. The judge signed the papers and declared the adoption final. Catherine got my new birth certificate with her last name replacing the one my grandparents had given me. She cried while holding the document, and I realized these were happy tears for maybe the first time in her life, after decades of sad ones. We went out for lunch afterward to celebrate, and my mother came with us, saying she was grateful I had someone strong taking care of me, while she continued working on getting better. The adoption hearing included a part where my mother addressed the judge directly. She stood up and said she was thankful her mother was raising me during her recovery. Her voice shook a little, but she spoke clearly about how knowing I was safe with Catherine gave her the strength to keep working on healing. She said she couldn't be a traditional mother right now because she was still learning how to be a person again after 12 years of being told she was crazy. But she wanted me to know she was trying hard, and she hoped someday we'd have the relationship we should have had all along. The judge thanked her for her statement and said it was clear I had two people who loved me very much. After the hearing, my mother hugged me tight and whispered that she was proud of me for being so strong. My birthday came in mid-August, and Catherine threw a party at her house. It was small with just my mother, Finn, Carlotta, and 3 friends from the school who I'd gotten close to over the past few months. Catherine made a cake from scratch and hung decorations in the living room. My school friends brought normal teenager gifts like books and gift cards. Finn gave me a fancy pen for journaling. Carlotta brought a photo album she'd been making with pictures from the past year, showing my journey from that first day at the neighbor's house to now. My mother gave me a wrapped package that turned out to be a journal she'd been writing in since leaving the psychiatric facility. She said it was full of letters to me about her memories, her recovery, and her hopes for our future relationship. She said she knew she couldn't be a regular mother right now, but she wanted me to understand her story and know she'd never stopped loving me even when they convinced her I didn't exist. Reading the first few pages later that night made me cry. This felt like my first real birthday, one that was actually about celebrating me instead of maintaining my grandparents' fake image of being normal, loving people. The journal my mother gave me became something I read often over the following weeks. She'd written about fragments of memory returning during therapy sessions. She described the confusion of being told for 12 years that her memories were delusions, while knowing deep down they were real. She wrote about the day Catherine and I walked into the visiting room and how terrified she was that we'd disappear if she believed we were real. She included hopes for our future, like teaching me to drive someday, or helping me pick a college, or just being someone I could call when I needed advice. She wrote about her own recovery and how hard it was to relearn basic life skills after being institutionalized for so long. Reading her words helped me understand that her distance wasn't rejection, but rather the careful way someone moves when they're still learning to trust that good things won't be taken away. As August ended and September approached, I found myself actually excited about starting junior year. This was new because I'd never looked forward to anything in my life before. But now I was safe living with Catherine in a house where nobody locked me in basements or planned to sell me. I was healing slowly with therapy and medication and support from people who actually cared. I had a grandmother who'd searched for 40 years and never gave up. I had a mother who was working hard to recover from 12 years of abuse disguised as treatment. I had friends at the school who liked me for who I was, not who I pretended to be. For the first time, I could think about the future without feeling terrified. I could imagine going to college or getting a job or just living a normal life. I was beginning to understand who I actually was, beyond what my grandparents had tried to make me, and that person was someone I might actually like. The first Sunday dinner happened the weekend after school started. Catherine set out ingredients on the counter, and my mother arrived right on time carrying a bag of fresh vegetables from the farmer's market. We decided to make lasagna together because my mother remembered it being her favorite as a kid. Catherine showed us how to layer the noodles and cheese while telling stories about teaching my mother to cook when she was little. My mother's hands shook a bit while spreading the ricotta, but she smiled the whole time. We sat at the dining table after and passed dishes around like normal families do. My mother asked about my classes and actually remembered the details when I mentioned them the next week. Catherine talked about her garden and the tomatoes she'd been growing all summer. Nobody mentioned basements or psychiatric facilities or grandparents in prison. We just ate and laughed, and my mother looked more alive than I'd ever seen her. This became our thing every Sunday without anyone officially deciding it. My mother would show up and we'd pick a recipe together and spend the afternoon in Catherine's kitchen. She got steadier each week, dropping things less often and remembering more stories from before everything got stolen from her. In September, a documentary filmmaker named Sarah Camacho contacted Catherine asking if we'd be willing to share our story for a film about trafficking cases. Catherine called a family meeting to discuss it, and we sat in her living room talking through what it would mean. My mother worried about people seeing her at her worst, but also said maybe our truth could help someone else recognize the signs of abuse. I thought about other kids trapped in basements or group homes who might see the documentary and realize they weren't alone. We agreed to do it together. The interview happened at Catherine's house with cameras and lights set up in the living room. I talked about the basement and the emails and finding out my whole life was a lie. My mother described the 12 years of being told her memories were delusions and how it felt when we walked into that visiting room. Catherine explained the 40 years of searching and never giving up even when everyone said to move on. Sarah asked hard questions, but we answered them honestly because hiding the truth was what let my grandparents hurt us for so long. Afterward, my mother hugged me tight and said she was proud we chose to speak up instead of staying silent. 3 weeks later, during our Sunday dinner, my mother set down her fork and announced she had news. She'd enrolled in online classes to finish her high school diploma since the institutionalization happened before she could graduate. Catherine started crying happy tears, and I laughed because we calculated that if everything went according to plan, we might graduate the same year. My mother joked that we could have a joint graduation party and share a cake. She said the classes were hard because her memory still had gaps, and some subjects felt completely new, but her teachers were patient, and she was determined to finish. I offered to help her study, and she smiled, saying, maybe we could do homework together sometimes. Catherine raised her glass of water in a toast to education and second chances and family dinners that felt like coming home. My mother's eyes were clear and focused in a way they hadn't been even a month ago. We cleaned up the dishes together and made plans for next Sunday's menu. Walking my mother to her car later, I realized this was what normal felt like. What family was supposed to be all along. Not perfect or easy, but real and safe and full of people who actually wanted to be there. The future stretched out ahead of us filled with possibilities instead of pain, with graduations and Sunday dinners and stories we'd keep building together 1 week at a time. That's it for today's story. Thanks for spending part of your day here. It really does mean a lot. I hope it left you with something gentle and good.